There are some tracks that can make DJ's life hell. The BPM's all over the place, they change tempo midway, or Rekordbox just gets the grid completely wrong. I used to hate dealing with them, so I just never played them, even if they were total bangers, and it meant effects and loops didn't sync properly. In this video, I'll share the 8 methods I use to fix any grid easily in Rekordbox. Some tracks Rekordbox just has trouble gridding properly. This can often happen with poor mastering, instrumental intros, or any genre of music that isn't house music. So how do we spot these tracks? Like a 40-year-old man wearing CK1, there is a few telltale signs we can look for. One of the biggest giveaways is the BPM value itself. Most modern electronic tracks have a nice round BPM value. So if there's a decimal point after the BPM, it probably means Rekordbox couldn't quite pick up the beat on the grid. Another big clue can be when the BPM is not what you expect for that particular genre of music. If I see a drum and bass track getting analysed at 143 BPM, I know something's up. But we can also find problems with a quick check of the grid in certain spots on the track. One of the easiest places to do this is on the drop. If there's not a downbeat on there, you probably need to pay closer attention. Alright, you found some tracks where there's something funky going on. How do you actually fix it? Let's deal with fixing BPM values first. I've got this track here, and I know it's a drum and bass tune, but Rekordbox has analysed it at 173.64 BPM. This is in the ballpark of what I'd expect for drum and bass, which is usually about 174 or 175. So the first thing I'm going to try is just rounding up the BPM to see if it fixes it. To do that, go into grid mode and manually type in the closest number, 174 in this case. After you press enter, the grid will move a little as Rekordbox applies the new BPM. Find the drop again and press the red bar marker to realign everything. But it's often not quite that simple, and Rekordbox is just way off. So how do we find out what the BPM of this track actually is? Now don't feel bad if you never thought of doing this, because I didn't either until recently. Just look on Google. Other search engines are available. This D&B track has been analysed at 157 BPM, which is definitely wrong. I'll just pop the track name and BPM into the Google rectangle of hope. Some really useful websites for finding the real BPM are TuneBat, Music Stacks, or Beatport. Unfortunately, these don't always agree with each other, but it's usually a good starting point. In this example, Music Stacks and Beatport both reckon it's 174 BPM, so I'm going to give that a try. I'll go back into Rekordbox, click into grid mode, and manually type in 174 BPM. After doing this, the grid will shift about again, so I set my downbeat back on the drop or other phrase using the red bar to get everything locked back in. If the BPM from the websites was correct, everything should now be fixed. But there may be some obscure or unreleased tracks that you can't find on Google. There's another tool we can use to find the true BPM of a track, and it's built right into Rekordbox in your hand. Stop picking your nose, Jimothy, because we're going to put that finger to better use. It's called the tap function, and you basically just tap along to the beat of a track to figure out what the BPM is. As you tap, Rekordbox will recalculate the BPM. The longer you tap, the more accurate it should get. But unless you have perfect timing, there'll probably still be a few decimal places in there. After I've been tapping for around 10 seconds or so, or till someone complains, I normally just round it up or down to the nearest BPM. I really like using this method to get in the general ballpark nice and quick. And because you can also do this tapping method on your decks, it can be a real lifesaver when you're actually performing. There's even a way you can mark your own homework. Rekordbox has got a metronome built in. If you don't know what that is, it's like a little tick sound that moves along to a certain BPM value. Musicians use it to keep time, and as self-proclaimed musicians, DJs can also use it to check the BPM of a track. To activate it, stay in grid mode and click the metronome icon. After you've corrected your BPM, play the track. You'll hear a ticking sound running at the BPM you've identified in your headphones. If the tick and the music line up, you've done your job. If you're still having trouble, there's another trick I've used in the past. Find a reference track with a known BPM from a similar genre, and get your calculator out because it's time to get mathsy. I'm going to load up track A as my reference track. I know this one's at 126 BPM because it's boring. On the other deck, I have track B, which Rekordbox has incorrectly detected as 95 BPM. The goal is to play both tracks and beat match track B to track A. Here, I find that increasing track B's tempo by about 2.4% results in the tracks being beat matched. That means track B must be 2.4% slower than track A's reference 126 BPM. Using some Stephen Hawking shit, I can see that the BPM must be near enough 123 BPM. I can now go into the grid mode, manually type in that value, and happy days, the grid is aligned. But there's another track that's way harder to deal with, and it brings Rekordbox to its knees. Older tracks, live recordings, or just mean producers are all examples of where the tempo of a track can change during the course of a tune. This can cause absolute chaos to the rigid regime of Rekordbox grids. To show you what I mean, I have this drum step track that I definitely didn't make with GarageBand loops. It starts at 174 BPM, but at the breakdown goes to 140 BPM. Then at the drop, it's back to 174. Rekordbox detects and grids this track as 174 BPM because that's what the intro is. The grid all looks fine until I get to the breakdown here where the tempo changes, and it all falls apart like a freshly dunked digestive. To deal with this, you can grid up specific sections of a track so Rekordbox treats them as individual sections. I'm going to jump into grid mode to apply this. I already know the first part of the track is gridded correctly, so I'll jump to the first BPM change, which occurs at the breakdown. I need to let Rekordbox know to do something different at this point. I'll zoom in a bit using the magnifying glass and line the playhead up to where the breakdown begins. Then I click the Make Adjustment from the Current Position button. Any grid before this point will not be affected, and everything after will. I'll then manually type in the new BPM value, which is 140 BPM. Looking through, I can now see that the grid on the breakdown is lined up correctly, but looking further ahead to the drop where the track changes back to 174 BPM, it's wrong again. All I need to do now is repeat the process by moving the playhead to the drop. Click the Make Adjustment from the Current Position button again, and type in 174. As before, all the gridding we've done before this point will be retained, and now the track is fixed. I covered this approach in a recent newsletter, so if you want more tips like that, sign up in the description. A quick tip here is to lock the grid after you've made these adjustments. Otherwise, they might get overwritten if you accidentally reanalyze the track. To do that, click the lock icon in grid mode. This method works great in a ton of scenarios, but there are some tracks where the BPM just slides all over the place. How do we deal with those? First, let's turn to our old friend automation. Rekordbox has 2 extra analysis modes built in that might help. Unlike normal mode, which is more optimized for consistent BPMs, dynamic mode attempts to compensate for different BPM changes. You can change it in Preferences, Analysis, Dynamic mode. You'll need to reanalyze the offending track after doing this. Right-click and choose Analyze. Sometimes it works quite well and can solve the problem, but if it doesn't, Rekordbox 7.07 has added a new high-precision beat gridding mode. You can switch this on in Preferences, Analysis and click the toggle for the high-precision mode. You can use this with either normal or dynamic analysis depending on the track. As before, reanalyze the broken track after applying the setting. This thing's still pretty new, so I need to do more testing on it, but early signs are pretty promising. It's managed to grid successfully some tracks I've had trouble with for years, but it is pretty slow compared to the other modes, so use it sparingly. There's still one final kind of track where none of this will work. It's those nightmare tracks that just will not play ball no matter what you do or how much time you spend on them. To deal with them, I like to use a slightly different approach. Even the most rebellious tracks have short sections where the BPM remains relatively constant. You need to hunt out those sections and try and tame them while someone's doing a freestyle sax solo over the top. The goal is to create a little pocket of rhythmic stability amongst the chaos. And the perfect tool for this is a loop. This little known track from the 60s is all over the place, and I'm not gonna waste my time trying to grid all of it. But I know there's a small section towards the end with a fairly steady yet insignificant drum loop for a couple of bars. I'll navigate to this part of the track and use the same approach as for tracks that have mid-tempo changes. In grid mode, I'm going to set the downbeat on the first beat of the drum loop using the red bar button. Then I'll click Make Adjustment from the Current Position. Using the tap method, I've worked out this bit is around 110 BPM, so I'll type that in and press enter. The grid is now reliable for this short section of the track. To make mixing out of the track easier, I'll come out of grid mode and create a loop to capture the fixed section. I'll save that loop to a hotkey and then click the little arrows to set the loop as active so it'll trigger automatically. Stems can also help massively here if you've got a really annoying instrument that's just muddying the whole mix. It's sort of like having X-ray vision for the track so you can find the bits that are actually in time. But getting the grid right is just the first step in an effective track preparation process. In this video, I show you how to set the perfect cue points on any track.